The committee will come to order. The Oversight Committee exists to secure two fundamental principles. First, Americans have the right to know that the money Washington takes from them is well spent. And second, Americans deserve an efficient, effective government that works for them. Our duty on the Government Reform Committee is to protect these rights. Our solemn responsibility is to hold government accountable to taxpayers, because taxpayers have a right to know what they get from their government. We must work tirelessly in partnership with citizen watchdogs to provide the American people the facts and bring genuine reform to Federal bureaucracy. We are here today to ask and examine fundamental questions about the security of HealthCare.gov. We recognize best practices were not followed. Was securing testing completed before the launch to the satisfaction of the experts will be asked. What did top information security officials at the Center for Medicare Services and the Department of Health and Human Services recommend? Were the people who knew about the technology empowered? Were the decision makers people who knew about the technology? Did leadership at CMS and HHS follow these recommendations? If there was disagreement between people below the top, were these questions and concerns properly delivered to higher-ups prior to the launch of the site? By now, the American people are well aware that there were functional problems in the HealthCare.gov website at launch. Many may know that other websites costing a fraction as much but doing the same thing worked better. For example, Kentucky and Hawaii launched sites that cost the Federal taxpayer about one-third as much and seemed to work better. Those questions and others need to be asked. But today, our real question is, why does the Administration steadfastly deny the existence of security problems and shortcomings and lack of security testing? Well, in fact, the experts, Federal employees we hear from today will testify that there were known shortcomings and, in fact, unanswered questions at the time of the launch. For many Americans, myself included, it seems to defy common sense that a website plagued with functional problems was, in fact, perfectly secure by design. Additionally, when an individual finds himself, well, in one website, getting information delivered to him by mail acknowledging another individual from another state, we certainly know that there must be some cross-connect within the system that occurred, and that, in fact, was reported in the days shortly after the launch. This and other areas do concern this committee, but most important, because we are the Oversight Committee for Federal Contracting and Federal Employees, our investigation has been active and attempted to get directly to the contractors, such as MITRE, who did an evaluation, that has been thwarted by the Administration, who warned and tried to interfere with this committee by asking vendors not to deliver us information. But through subpoena, we have learned that, in fact, there were flaws. They were reported. It is now undeniable that MITRE and other companies did their job sufficient for people to know an alarm was being sounded in the days before the launch. We have acted to protect the information we receive from those entities. Notwithstanding that, we have had repeated interference and claims that, in fact, we are the ones that are going to disclose a roadmap to hackers. What is so amazing is, in fact, the Administration would like you to believe that, first, there were no problems, second, any problems that there were, even though there were no problems, have been mitigated, or, as I would quote or paraphrase the Administration, plans to mitigate are in place. I've been in business a long time before I came to Congress. A plan to mitigate means you have not mitigated. Therefore, we will assume that any and all information given to us about known security risks at the time or prior to the time of the launch are still there. Our witnesses today, for the most part, cannot refute that, because what we discover is they have not been personally assured item by item of the actual mitigation of those shortcomings. As I talk in circles to a certain extent, I do so because we continue to hear from the administration there were no problems, the problems have been mitigated, and, oh, by the way, if you put out information about the problems others say exist, you're creating a roadmap to hackers. I don't think anyone can square that, not my ranking member, not our witnesses. For that reason, again, this committee will continue to look at all reports of alleged security shortcomings or unknown areas as, in fact, very, very important to keep private. And we will do so because we must assume that the website is still vulnerable, that the American people may, as we speak, be having their personal identifiable information hacked and taken, that in fact we cannot consider the website secure. If anyone would like to say the website is secure today, then I ask, would you allow the former flaws to be put out there? And the answer, of course, will be no. In Washington, people like to talk out of both sides of their mouth. They like to say there never was a problem, the problem there never was has been fixed, and in fact, you may not put out records of the problem that never were because, in fact, they are known vulnerabilities. That is what we are facing today as we go into this. It would be comic if it wasn't, in fact, all of your IRS records, links to Health and Human Services, of course, but links to the Department of Homeland Security and others. This website has tentacles into some of the most personal information, and in the future, even more. More importantly, states have links into this same database, and in fact, one of the things we know, which will not be the prime subject today, is that the states, for the most part, were not end-to-end tested. The states were not held to a standard of best practices. My only hope is that as we look to the billions of dollars provided in Federal taxpayer money to the states, that in fact consistently they did a better job in both operational readiness and security. But that is but a hope. Today's hearing will be about the failures, or at least the failures to use best practices that went into the launch of this site. Lastly, in a few minutes I will be putting into the record a series of exchanges that went on between the White House and the Speaker, between the Secretary of Health and Human Services through her surrogates and the Chairman. And I will do so because I think it is important to understand this is a serious, serious hearing. It is one in which the White House went to the Speaker of the House warning about the release of information and asking that information not be seen, not be heard, and not be delivered to this committee. It is one in which the Secretary said she wanted to meet through, again, to me. I flew back, and she refused to meet with me even though she was in town. I am deeply disappointed that we are here today still dealing with the inability to deal with what happened prior to October 1st, what has happened since October 1st, and I think most importantly, a committee that on a bipartisan basis supports real reforms that in many cases would have mitigated or eliminated some of the mistakes made and would have allowed the President's signature legislation to not be marred by a website that failed to perform at its launch and is still questionable in its security. Lastly, I certainly want to make sure that we all understand the American people know that companies have been hacked, that credit card information has been taken. It has been widely publicized. The difference between Target and other companies who dealt with hackers is we don't have to put our credit card into that machine at Target. We don't have to deliver that information. We have the choice of paying cash. We have the choice of not registering. We do not, no one on this dais has the ability to say, I won't go into Obamacare. It is mandated by a law that I did not vote for, that the American people did not agree with, but went forward anyway on a purely partisan basis.
Mr. Chairman?
So therefore,
Mr. Chairman, we're going on 15 minutes now.
Therefore, I want to make it very clear. We take serious that the standard for security on the government side must be higher, and today's witnesses will help us begin the process of understanding how it could be higher. I now recognize Mr. Cummings for his opening statement. He is not recognized. The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I just want a point of order.
The gentleman is not recognized. The gentleman is not in order.
I can't recognize at all.
The gentleman is not recognized.
You're going on for 15 minutes.
The gentleman is not in order. Mr. Cummings is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. You're absolutely right. This is a very, very serious hearing, but I think we need to be very careful and be reminded that we've got 110 million Americans, our constituents. You say they could use cash at Target. A lot of them don't have cash because they don't have jobs. Give me a break. It's good to be here this morning. Today is the 22nd hearing our committee has held on the Affordable Care Act. 22. We've spent more time on this one issue over the past 3 years than any other topic. And Mr. Chairman, I agree. We want to get this right. This is so very, very important. The consequences of what we do affect all of our constituents. And there are people watching us right now who are suffering from dreadful diseases, who are praying and hoping that we get it right. And I am determined to work hard with you to make sure that happens. But I'm concerned about them, but I'm also concerned about this 110 million of our constituents who have been placed in a vulnerable position with regard to their Target credit cards. And I'm going to go further on that a little bit later. So where are we today? The law that went into full effect, full effect, on January 1st, and now millions of people are getting health insurance they did not have before. They're receiving critical medical care. They have the security of knowing they will not be bankrupt if they get into an accident or get sick. But there's something more important, just as important as all of that. Even under those circumstances, they are allowed to live in dignity. Dignity. That's what our nation is all about, lifting up each other so that we all live in dignity. And so this is a phenomenal accomplishment. The law also put into place key protections for consumers, and I'm so glad it did. I'm so glad. Insurance companies are now prohibited from discriminating against people with cancer, our constituents, diabetes and other pre-existing conditions, our constituents, both Republican and Democrat, both rural and urban. Insurance companies may not charge higher prices for women, and millions of people are now receiving free preventative care. That is so important. It is cheaper to keep somebody well than to treat them after they're sick. There are also huge financial benefits. Health insurance companies are now sending rebate checks to millions of people. Since the law was passed, we have seen the lowest growth in health care costs in 50 years. If we repealed the law today, it would increase our deficit by more than $1.5 trillion. Despite all of these positive results, Republicans are still obsessed with killing this law. After more than 40 votes in the House, They shut down the government in an unsuccessful attempt to defund the law. Now they've shifted to a new tactic. Oh, this is brand new, hot off the press. Scaring people away from HealthCare.gov website. Everyone agrees that initially the website's performance was seriously flawed. Our committee has a legitimate interest in investigating contractor performance and agency oversight, and we have held multiple hearings on this topic already. But let me pause here for a moment, and I'm just reminded of what Emerson said, a favorite quote of Mandela. He said, do not be in fear and fail to act because of your fears and your problems, but be led by your hopes and your dreams. And this is about the hopes and the dreams of Americans to stay well, to make sure that their children are well, to make sure that if they get sick, they don't have to go into bankruptcy. That's what this is all about, and that's why you're right, Mr. Chairman. This hearing is serious because it has consequences. In terms of security of the website, however, it is important to highlight all of the facts instead of cherry-picking, I said it, cherry-picking partial information to promote a political narrative that is inaccurate. Based on the documents we have reviewed, and that, when I say we, I mean Republicans and Democrats, and the interviews we've conducted, I believe we can establish several key facts. Number one, although some employees expressed concerns with security testing before this website was launched, the agency addressed these risks by implementing a strong mitigation plan as part of the Authority to Operate memo that was issued on September 27th. Second, since that time, the agency has complied successfully with the mitigation plan. The agency has now compelled full end-to-end security testing of the system, and it addressed specific issues that arose in a timely manner. Third, witnesses interviewed by the committee have praised the current level of security testing. They have described multiple layers of ongoing, robust protection that meet and in some cases exceed federal standards. As Ms. Fryer put it during her interview, the agency is using, and these are your words, Ms. Fryer, correct me if I'm wrong. Ms. Fryer said, she's one of our witnesses, she said that the agency is using, quote, best practices, Mr. Chairman, above and beyond that which is usually recommended, end of quote. So, Ms. Fryer, I hope you clear that up. Make it clear to us where you stand. Finally, most importantly, to date, there have been no successful attacks on HealthCare.gov by domestic hackers, foreign entities, or others who seek to harm our national security. Nobody's personal information has been maliciously hacked. Now, we need to be careful. Obviously, this could change given the increasing frequency and sophistication of attacks against all federal IT systems. But the evidence obtained by our committee, and when I say our committee, I mean Republicans and Democrats, indicates that the security of HealthCare.gov is strong and it keeps getting stronger. In very stark contrast, up to 110 million Americans were subjected to one of the most massive information technology breaches in history when their credit, debit, and other personal information was compromised at Target stores and online in November and December. Mr. Chairman, I sent you a letter on Tuesday requesting a hearing on the Target breach, and I understand you have agreed to have our staffs meet on this issue next week, and I thank you for that. If our committee can hold dozens of hearings on the Affordable Care Act and on HealthCare.gov, which has not been successfully attacked to date, surely we can hold at least one hearing at the earliest possible date on the massive Target breach that affected more than 100 million of our constituents. As I close, I want to close by thanking Dr. Charest. You've been pulling double duty, providing multiple classified briefings to Congress in addition to your day job. We thank you. Ms. Fryer, your name has been thrown around on the House floor when I'm sure you've heard about it, but you have your opportunity today to clarify what it is, whatever it is you have to say. And Mr. Bateman, after finishing a day-long interview less than 36 hours ago, you were handed a letter inviting you to testify here today, and we thank you. I want you all to know that we appreciate everything you and your staffs are doing to remain vigilant and constantly monitor the security of the website. Millions of American families, thank you for helping them. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I thank you, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. I now ask unanimous consent that letters dated December 15th, 2013 from the White House, December 17th from this committee, email exchanges from December 23rd, January 15th, and a letter to Secretary Sebelius on January 15th be placed in the record and copies be made for and distributed. Without objection, so ordered. We now go to, and all members may have 7 days in which to submit their opening statements and other information. We now welcome our panel of witnesses. Mr. Kevin Charest, Ph.D., is the Chief Information Security Officer at the Department of Health and Human Services. Ms. Teresa Fryer is the Chief Information Security Officer at the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, which will undoubtedly be called CMS throughout the hearing. And Mr. Frank Bateman is the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Information Technology and Chief Information Officer at the Department of Health and Human Services. And again, I thank you for back-to-back appearances. Pursuant to the committee rules, would you please raise your right hand to take the oath? Do you solemnly swear or affirm the testimony you are about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Please be seated. Let the record reflect that all witnesses answered in the affirmative. In order to deal with a fairly short period of time, one of our witnesses has a hard stop at 12, which we are going to very much try to respect, and we are likely to have a vote more or less at that time. I want to announce that I will ask you to stay within that 5-minute opening statement, and I will be very strict on the gavel today, which is not the history of this committee. So we want everyone to ask their questions and complete their questions well prior to 5 minutes. I won't cut off a witness answering a question, but I will cut off exactly at 5 minutes a question that's droning on, and I will curtail the answer of questions if, in fact, it is unable to be answered within a short period of time. And I say this because I want to get through all the people on the dais and allow our witnesses to leave timely. Additionally, if witnesses need to excuse themselves for a short period of time, please just go ahead, signal to the clerk, do it, and use the facilities back here. Other than that, Mr. Charest, you are recognized.
Good morning, Chairman Issa, Ranking Member Cummings, and members of this committee. My name is Kevin Charest, and I am the Chief Information Security Officer for the United States Department of Health and Human Services. The Department of Health and Human Services is the United States government's principal agency for protecting the health of all Americans, providing essential human services, especially for those who are least able to help themselves. The HHS Office of the Secretary and the Department's 11 operating divisions administer more than 300 programs covering a wide spectrum of activities. The Office of the Chief Information Officer, in which I serve, is a part of OS. Our responsibility as one of the staff divisions of OS is to manage programs within OS and support the 11 operating divisions in carrying out their various and diverse missions. It is important to point out, however, that we manage the Department's information technology portfolio through a federated governance structure. The vast majority of the Department's IT resources are tied directly to the appropriations and statutory authorities Congress provides directly to our programs and operating divisions. Our governance authorities at the OS level reflect the federated structure. Thus, many of HHS's operating divisions have their own Chief Information Officer, Chief Information Security Officer, and IT management structure. The exception of this rule is in OS, where the Department CIO and CISO perform those responsibilities. HHS's enterprise-wide information security and privacy program was launched in fiscal year 2003 to help protect HHS, including its operating divisions, against potential information technology threats and vulnerabilities. The program ensures compliance with Federal mandates and legislation, including the Federal Information Security Management Act. Under my leadership, I have established a framework for operating divisions to regularly report incidents involving IT security to my office. Operating divisions routinely report potential information security incidents to the HHS Computer Security Incident Response Center, which I oversee. In addition to our internal investigation of all IT security incidents, we report all such incidents to the Department of Homeland Security's Computer Emergency Readiness Team at DHS's National Cybersecurity and Communications Integration Center. The U.S. CERT's Operations Center, U.S. CERT accepts, triages, and collaboratively responds to incidents, provides technical assistance to information system operators, and disseminates timely notifications regarding current and potential security threats and vulnerabilities. For reference, in fiscal year 2013, U.S. CERT processed approximately 228,700 cyber incidents, an average of more than 620 per day, including Federal agencies, critical infrastructure, and industry partners. It is important to note that HHS operates a defense in-depth strategy for protecting its assets in accordance with guidance issued by the Office of Management Budget and National Institute of Standards and Technology, which has been reflected in HHS's information security policy. This strategy includes the use of risk-based approach to authorizing systems to operate, a robust set of technologies for continuous monitoring of systems, standards and minimum requirements for systems, as well as the appropriate business processes and controls to ensure the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of all HHS IT assets. Consistent with these policies, CMS reports actual or suspected computer security incidents in connection with HealthCare.gov to the CSIRT. The reports are based on the operational security protections CMS has in place to deter and prevent unauthorized access, and weekly penetration testing and security scans of the system. CMS's Chief Information Security Officer and its Information System Security Officer are responsible for designing and maintaining a security program to mitigate any risks identified in accordance with FISMA. Additionally, building on Federal guidelines and regulations and in conformance with industry standards, HHS has dedicated teams of career experts, including officials from the Office of the Chief Information Officer, the Office of Inspector General, Office of Civil Rights Privacy Office, the CSIRT, and key operating divisions, who work around the clock to identify, manage, mitigate suspected or potential breaches of PII. In carrying out their work, those teams abide by HHS's PII Breach Response Team Policy, published in 2008, and HHS's Privacy Incident Response Team Charter, published in 2011. HHS security and privacy experts work with appropriate Federal government and industry professionals to do the following: we validate risk and review and approve response plans, review and approve communications or notice to affected individuals, perform analysis on data in order to recommend strategies to effectively refine and improve the Department's defense in a potential loss of PII. Implement privacy and security solutions that can reduce the potential loss of PII, and finally, monitor the privacy and security environment to raise awareness of threats to PII within the Department. If the team determines that notification of a breach is warranted, the operating division coordinates through the PERT to send letters to the affected consumers or businesses informing them of the breach. I appreciate the opportunity to meet with you today and discuss your interests in the Federal Government's IT security practices.
Thank you. Ms. Fryer.
Chairman Issa, Ranking Member Cummings, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to speak about my role in protecting the security of the federally facilitated marketplace, also known as FFM. As a career civil servant, I have decades of experience in information security, not only at CMS but also at NASA, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Office of Personnel Management, and 20 years at security positions in the Navy. In my current role as Chief Information Security Officer for CMS, my responsibilities include issuing CMS information security policy, ensuring the CMS systems comply with applicable laws and regulations, and providing oversight to maintain the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of all CMS information and information systems. CMS has a long track record of successfully securing and protecting almost 200 complex IT systems related not only to FFM, but also to Medicare, Medicaid, and the Children's Health Insurance Program. In my role as a CISO at CMS, I lead the team that is responsible for overseeing the independent security control assessments of CMS systems, including the FFM. These are conducted to assess the effectiveness of the security controls that CMS has implemented in the agency's information systems. Independent security contractors completed a security control assessment of the FFM on December 18th with no open high findings. This security control assessment met all industry standards, was an end-to-end test, and was conducted in a stable environment that allowed for testing to be completed in the allotted time. Given the positive results of the recent security controls assessment, the ability to complete comprehensive security testing, and a mitigation plan in place, I would recommend the FFM to be given a new authority to operate when the current authority expires in March. The FFM authorization to operate that is currently in place has a number of strategies to ensure the FFM is protected against attacks and mitigates risks, including regular testing that exceeds best practices and a requirement to perform a full security controls assessment within 90 days of the launch. The risk mitigation strategies and compensating controls that were prescribed are being implemented and executed as planned. The protections that we have put in place have successfully prevented attacks. There have been no successful security attacks on the FFM, and no person or group has maliciously accessed personally identifiable information. As part of this mitigation plan, CMS established a dedicated security team, of which I am a member, to monitor, track, and ensure the activities in the ATO memo are completed. This team is responsible for the weekly testing of boarded devices and Internet-facing web servers and scans using continuous monitoring tools. Ongoing vulnerability assessments of the FFM network infrastructure and Internet-facing web servers are conducted through penetration testing, which involves simulated attacks to breach the security defense of the website, and continuous monitoring of marketplace-related systems to alert security professionals of any new vulnerabilities that may exist due to recent changes or maintenance. Information from these tests has enabled us to prevent any successful attacks on the FFM. While no serious security professional will ever guarantee that any system is hack-proof, I am confident, based on the recent security controls assessment and the additional security protections in place, that the FFM is secure. In many instances, we have gone above and beyond what is required with layered protection, continuous monitoring, and additional penetration testing. CMS takes system security very seriously. My job is to anticipate and detect any possible security threat to our many systems, no matter how small. We continue to carry out this responsibility, protecting the FFM to ensure that consumers can use the system with confidence that their personal information is secure. Thank you, and I'm happy to take your questions.
Thank you. And because we were not provided your opening statement, what date was that security assessment that causes you to recommend completed?
It was completed on December 18th.
December 18th.
I'm sorry. Yes, it was completed December 18th.
Thank you. Mr. Bateman.
Good morning, Chairman Issa, Ranking Member Cummings, and members of the committee. My name is Frank Bateman, and I'm the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Information Technology and the Chief Information Officer at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. While I appreciate the committee's interest in HealthCare.gov, as you know, 2 days ago I spent 8 hours in a transcribed interview with the committee staff and with you and Representative Jordan, respectively, answering your questions. I received the committee's invitation to testify at today's hearing approximately 36 hours ago at the close of Tuesday's transcribed interview. I will do my best to answer any questions you may still have, given the minimal time that I've had to prepare. I'd like to make clear to the committee the role of my office, that is the Office of the Chief Information Officer for the Department of Health and Human Services, in HealthCare.gov. I personally, and my office generally, have very little visibility into the development and operational oversight for the website. The Department manages its IT portfolio through a federated governance structure. Most of HHS's operating divisions have their own Chief Information Officer and Chief Information Security Officer, one of whom is with us today, as well as their own IT management structure. The vast majority of the Department's IT resources are directly tied to appropriations made to our programs and operating divisions, and our governance structure reflects this reality. Management and governance of HealthCare.gov was comparable to the management of similar IT initiatives throughout the Department's 11 operating divisions. And as with Medicare.gov and Medicare Part D prescription drug program, the development and security of HealthCare.gov website has been led by CMS, which is the business owner for the system. Neither I nor my office had operational control over or responsibility for HealthCare.gov. Since I joined the Department less than 2 years ago, we've been working to restructure and update our IT governance to bring greater visibility into what the Department buys and builds across all of our 11 operating divisions. We're in the process of putting in place 3 IT steering committees to bring together technology and program leaders from across the Department to improve our purchasing and management of information technology resources. With respect to HealthCare.gov specifically, I'd like to reiterate something that I described to the committee on a number of occasions during my transcribed interview on Tuesday. Any discussions that I had regarding the rollout and launch of the website were based upon my past experiences in the private sector and the practices of tech companies that are often used. I did not have any personal, direct, or detailed knowledge of the development or security of the website, so it would not have been appropriate for me to make recommendations on operational decisions, and accordingly, I did not. As I also said in response to the committee's questions, it is totally appropriate and consistent with NIST guidelines that operational decisions about the technical aspects of HealthCare.gov be made by the administrator of CMS because of that individual's ability to broadly assess the acceptable risk for operating the system. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have, Chairman.
Thank you. Ms. Fryer, I'm going to take you through a couple of quick slides here. They're all from the report that was not published. And as they put up the slide, I want to first, this particular slide was, or these slides were provided to us after we initially interviewed you. And this was a memo never sent. Would you please tell us why this memo was never sent?
So this was a memo that I initially was drafting to send to the Chief Information Officer.
Right, and you chose not to send it because of?
Because events had taken place the next week with the Chief Information Officer drafting the risk decision memo.
In other words?
So it was overcome by events.
Events, okay. So, but it's still a good one for us to look at because it's consistent with your recommendations and your thought at the time. So in slide 1 of the draft, you wrote, FFM does not reasonably meet the CMS security requirements which are intended to minimize CMS business risk. Is that correct?
During the security assessment that was conducted in September, the security testing was not able to be completed. They weren't able to test completely.
But these are your words.
Yes.
Okay. Additionally, you said there is also no confidence that personal identifiable information will be protected. Correct?
Again, there was security testing in
right, but these are your words.
I drafted this initial memo.
Okay. And these are consistent with what you were saying in meetings in the September 20th time frame.
This memo was capturing the briefing that we had given to Mr. Charest and Mr. Bateman and the CIO on September.
Okay. So the other two witnesses knew that these are your words, but in a paraphrased, what you told them, there is also no confidence that personal identifiable information will be protected. It's in slide 1A.
Right. Again, it was the results of the security testing that had occurred.
So in slide 1B, you wrote, they'll put that up, the independent assessor was forced to test different modules in multiple environments. In other words, no end-to-end, as it was going to be launched testing, correct?
Yes.
Okay. In slide 1C, you wrote, complete end-to-end testing of FMM never occurred. That's correct, right?
Yes.
And that's best practices, of course, right?
Yes.
And you now testified in your opener that on December 18th, end-to-end testing was completed, and that's why you now have confidence that at least a snapshot of the site as it was that day would meet the requirements, subject to additional changes that occur in maintenance and modification, right?
On the testing that was conducted on December 18th, yes.
Okay. In slide 1C, you wrote, the majority of the testing efforts were focused on testing the expected functionality of the application, not security. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Again, in slide 1C, you wrote, several factors contributed to the limited effectiveness of the SSA modules and their interconnects. Can you expect that this could be a problem? And I guess in 1C, you're saying yes, you're concerned about that area. Is that right?
Again, this was a memo that I was drafting. I didn't complete it, so some of these things hadn't been done.
Okay, but
verified.
Slide 1C also says, valid test data was not provided prior to testing to give the true environment, correct?
Yes, normally it is put into the system for the security testers beforehand, right, so it doesn't delay testing.
So it's common to get real data, or at least data that is substantially real in both size and in cells and information in order to do real assessment, and that wasn't done. Is that correct?
Test data was put into, yes, it was just a delay in getting the test data put into the system. Okay,
so the two witnesses here were aware of essentially this information when you made your recommendation that it basically wasn't ready to launch, or at least you were uncomfortable with whether or not it was ready because of the lack of end-to-end testing and the like. Is that correct?
Right. My responsibility as the Chief Information Security Officer is to give an assessment to the Chief Information Officer on the risks that were discovered during independent testing.
And Mr. Charest, of course, was aware of this and concerns, plus had independent knowledge. Mr. Bateman, yesterday in testimony you told us that you recommended a less than full rollout in a meeting, I believe September 10th, essentially saying with what the problems and so on, best practices in your opinion would have been to roll out a portion of this rather than the size and scope that was rolled out on October 1st. You didn't characterize it completely as a recommendation, but it was certainly something you put out. In retrospect, would you prefer that to have been the way this site launched? In other words, more like a beta in order to mitigate what we now know was pretty much a bad launch?
Well, as you point out, Mr. Chairman, it wasn't actually a recommendation. It was a discussion topic for the meeting, and it was based upon my experience in the private sector, having seen this being done elsewhere. Sometimes it's referred to as a beta launch. It would be a controlled and measured launch. In retrospect, I don't know that I can say because I didn't have direct knowledge of the system, the operational, the development issues.
Thank you. Mr. Cummings.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Over the past few months, House Republicans have made a number of extraordinarily unfounded claims about the security of HealthCare.gov. This scare tactic appears to be part of a coordinated campaign to frighten people away from HealthCare.gov's website. I want to make sure we separate fact from fiction today and tell the American people the whole truth. I would like to go down the line with each of you and ask whether there have been any successful security attacks against the website. Dr. Charest, let me start with you. You oversee HHS's incident response team. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
So if there is an attack on HealthCare.gov, you would know about it. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
Dr. Charest, to date, I want you to look at me now. Has there been a single successful security attack against HealthCare.gov by a domestic hacker, foreign bad actor, or any other malicious individual group?
No, sir. There have been no reported attacks of any type on any malicious intent, either domestic or foreign. Mr.
Bateman, let me turn to you. You are the Chief Information Officer at HHS. My constituents and our constituents are looking at you. They're depending on your information. Have there been any successful attacks against the website?
There have been no reported successful attacks against the website.
Ms. Fryer, you are the Chief Information Security Officer for CMS. Have there been any successful attacks against the system?
No, there have been no successful attacks.
So you all agree that over the past 3.5 months, since the website has been live, there have been no successful attacks against the HealthCare.gov website, and I think that this is a very, very critical point. Last November, the CIO of Foreground Security testified before the House Energy and Commerce Committee, this company is one of the contractors that conducts continuous security monitoring of the website. The CIO testified that nobody could guarantee with 100% certainty that HealthCare.gov was secure from external hackers. Do you all agree with that?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Yes, I do.
And he stated this, and I quote, he said, I also would say the same thing about Facebook or any banking website as well, end of quote. Dr. Charest, Mr. Bateman, during your interviews with the committee staff, you told us that you agree with this statement. You have both worked in the private sector. Can you both explain why HealthCare.gov is no more risky than commercial sites like Facebook? Mr. Charest.
Yes, sir. So in essence, there are always variabilities. There's a number of vulnerabilities. All of these sites rely on underlying infrastructure, third-party softwares. All of these variables coming together create an environment which can be compromised candidly at any time. So you have to be vigilant. As a defender, we have to defend against every possible attack. And the attacker, in essence, has to find the one way in which we have not defended. So they're all always at some level of risk.
Now, Mr. Bateman, would you have anything to add to that, or do you agree or disagree?
I agree. No site is perfect, and we need to be vigilant, which is why we have layers of security.
Now, although there have been no successful attacks against HealthCare.gov to date, we have to keep in mind that there are constant attempts by malicious individuals and groups, both domestic and foreign, to attack large, complex government IT systems. We're all concerned about that, both Republicans and Democrats. While we have to remain one step ahead of the hackers, I thank you for clearing all of this up, the confusion that may have occurred. Our job is to ensure that the American people have accurate information so they are not wrongfully deterred from obtaining the critical health care coverage they need and deserve. Now, I want to go to you just very briefly, Ms. Fryer. The Chairman asked you some questions, and I just want to summarize as I close. I want to make sure that I have this right, so let me ask you a series of very basic questions. The draft memorandum that he talked about, you're familiar, right?
Yes.
Did you ever send a memorandum to anybody?
No, I did.
Anybody?
No, I did not, sir.
You never sent it to your boss, Mr. Trinkle?
No, sir.
You never sent it to Administrator Tavener?
No, sir.
So you never pressed the send button?
No, sir.
During your interview with the committee staff, you explained that you stopped working on the memo and put it aside after you found out that your superiors were moving forward with the September 27th ATO, which included the mitigation measures we have been discussing. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
And did you ever finalize your draft memo?
No, sir.
So you never finished it?
No, sir.
Do you know if all of the information in the memorandum is accurate?
No, sir. I was still validating the information.
Very well. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Mica.
Well, just a commentary. I heard the ranking member start out, and I'm as concerned. I come from a family that didn't have health care at times in our life, and there are about 42 to 45 million Americans that don't have health care. And yet we rolled out a flawed system. Everyone from the President of the United States to members of Congress on both sides of the aisle said the rollout from a technical standpoint was a meltdown and a fiasco. That was accessing it. We signed up about 1 million people. I'm one of the unwilling participants in that, and others had no other choice, really. But we knocked 6 million people off of their health care system. This is a great record of success, and we probably left 41 to 44 million people still without health care. So I had to comment when I heard that. Ms. Fryer, you did in fact draft this memo of the 24th, right? And that was up there, yes. And it said that this platform basically doesn't reasonably meet the CMS security requirements, which are intended to minimize CMS business risk, enterprise risks, or the application risk. There's also no confidence that the personal identifiable information will be protected. You wrote that on the 24th, right?
Yes.
The 27th, what happened? Ms. Tavener, didn't she sign the authority to operate? On the 27th, she signed the authority to operate. Is that the event that overcame this? You wrote the memo. Who did you share the contents of this memo? That there wasn't assurance when this was rolled out. It's bad enough the thing wouldn't work from a technical standpoint, or millions of people who wanted health care couldn't access the system. In fact, I was served by a waitress the other day, and she says, I wanted to get on it. I still don't have it because I couldn't access it. But it was flawed from the standpoint of being able to access it or work from an operational standpoint, right?
My responsibility,
at least initially, right?
My responsibility was to brief my management and the Chief Information
Your
Officer.
security, but you wrote that it wasn't ready for prime time rollout for security, right? And then you said events that overtook this. Well, the event was, in fact, that the Tavener, she signed the ATO. Did you sign the ATO?
No, I did not. It's not my responsibility.
In fact, I saw at the end of the ATO, you put a little caveat to protect your rear end, kind of. You put this paragraph at the end of the ATO, didn't you?
Mr. Chairman. My responsibility is to brief the CIO on the
the lady will suspend. The gentleman will suspend.
Mr. Chairman, I would like to suggest that we all—
No, the gentlelady will state her point of parliamentary inquiry, please.
Personal privilege.
Point of personal privilege. Please state it.
Mr. Chairman, I think that we should show respect to the persons who are—
That is not a point of personal privilege. Please state a point of personal privilege.
Well, I'm offended by the fact that—
Okay. If the gentlelady can organize an actual procedural request, we'll reconsider it at that time. The gentleman may continue.
Okay. Well, I understand. And again, protecting yourself, I may have used a term that some member found offensive, but protecting your rear end, everybody knows it around here. Ms. Fryer, last December you testified to the committee that prior to October 1st launch, you recommended again to deny the exchange's authority to operate, also known as the ATO, which is a document necessary to the website. For the record, is that accurate?
Yes.
Why did you make this recommendation?
The testing in September there were some issues that were encountered during the testing, so there was a level of uncertainty as to the known risks.
Who did you make the recommendation to?
My responsibility is to make the recommendation to my management and the Chief Information Officer of CMS.
Okay. Mr. Fryer, or Ms. Fryer, you also testified that you communicated your recommendation to Mr. Trinkle, and he shared your concerns. Is that correct?
Yes.
Did he sign the authority to operate the ATO?
No, he did not.
He did not. When did you learn Mr. Trinkle was also not comfortable enough to sign the ATO?
It was probably during our conversation, during the security testing, when there were problems that were being encountered.
So that was early.
And on September 20th, when I briefed him and Mr. Trinkle and Mr. Bateman and
Did Mr. Trinkle tell you why he decided not to sign the ATO?
No, he did not.
Did you ever brief Administrator Tavener on the security risks in the Federal Exchange?
No, I did not.
Did you, Mr. Charest, and also Mr. Bateman?
You may answer.
No, sir, I never briefed
Mr. Bateman?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
Did you counsel with Ms. Tavener on security issues?
No, I did not.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. The gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Tierney, is recognized.
Thank you very much. Thank all of the witnesses for their work and for being here again today. So essentially what we've established is that we have a memorandum that allows the majority apparently to raise the specter of problems only to find out that it was never sent to anyone because those issues have been addressed and dealt with, and now we have a system that has not had any successful attack since then. But we continue to go over and over and over this because if we do go over and over, maybe somebody will think that there's a real problem. But let's talk about the real problem. So we've spent a lot of time doing that on this committee, Oversight Committee, had hearings and subpoenaed documents and conducted interviews. Mr. Bateman, ad nauseum, with respect to you at least. The good news is that there have been no successful attacks and security against the website, but every day people do attempt from time to time. So I have a modest suggestion here. Why don't we try to find out who's doing that? This is an oversight and investigatory committee. After all, it seems to me that if we have a website and people want to have health care, but there are people trying to prevent them from doing that, and by that I don't reference my colleagues here, I reference people that are trying to, although many people are tiresome of the efforts to repeal, I'm talking about people that are trying to get into the system and destroy it. We ought to go after those bad guys on that basis. There are reports out there, pretty wide range set of reports describing some of the malicious groups that are organizing to try to do this. One example is a group that developed a program called Destroy Obamacare. Are you familiar with that, Mr. Bateman?
Yes, I've seen reports of it.
And apparently what they were doing was trying to have a denial of service tool. Can one of you explain what that is, Mr. Charest?
Yes, sir. So in the case of Destroy Obamacare and on all denial of service tools, the basic premise is to flood the website with potentially even appropriate traffic, but such that legitimate users cannot access the site. It's overloaded in essence.
So the specter that's been raised is trying to be made true by people that are taking an overt action to try and interfere with the system. Would that be right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So the reports, press reports indicate that these are, in their words, right-wing groups motivated not by financial gain but sort of a political animus. They disagree with the Affordable Care Act, so they're trying to intentionally block applicants from actually getting access and getting the right that's entitled to them under the law. Is it a crime, Dr. Charest, for them to do this?
I'm not an attorney, sir, but I believe it is.
And who investigates those types of attacks?
In the event, and we did investigate the Destroy Obamacare code and those, not the actors, that's not our role, but the attempted attack, we found it to be rudimentary. But we did report, as we report all these incidents, to the Officer Inspector General, and they received that information and would indeed investigate if appropriate.
Okay. And would they investigate to try to determine who the individuals leading this attack are?
That's my understanding, sir, but they would have to tell you their procedures.
Okay. And perhaps that's a good action for this committee would be to meet with those people and find out where they're going and what they're finding out. Does your incident response team go at all, in terms of checking out these allegations to look to see who's undermining it? Do you look to see how you can trace back on the site where it may originate or where the site is hosted?
Yes, sir. We'll trace back what we call the command and control, all the elements of the attack as best as we can, and then we'll share that with DHS, law enforcement, and others as appropriate.
Okay. And do you think that if the right people were investigating this, they would be able to, in fact, locate and find who these people are? Is there a likelihood of that?
It's possible, sir, but these things are fairly mercurial. IP addresses are rapidly changing. Websites come up and down pretty often. So the reality is, though, that very often they are found.
Okay. And it's because of that mercurial aspect and other things and constant attacks that you have the need for layered security. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And that layered security, once again, has been successful to date in stopping any successful hacking attack.
Yes, sir. To date it has.
All right. But because all systems, whether they're private or public like this, are constantly under attack, we have to be vigilant, and that's exactly what all of you are doing. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. Around the clock.
Well, I thank you for your efforts. And, Mr. Chairman, I think that I would ask that the committee consider an investigation pursuing those who are making attempts to attack and hack this site for whether it's political animus or any other means on that. I think that would be an appropriate activity for us to do. That seems to be the real danger here, interfering with people's rights to have health care under the plan.
The gentleman absolutely is right. Cybersecurity is part of our core jurisdiction. Mr. Connolly and I also spoke this morning at a cloud computing conference. So that is an area of not only interest but a willingness to put staff and dais time into. If I may, Mr. Cummings and I have been discussing, and I'll be brief, the fact that we need to link in, as part of our committee jurisdiction, other areas of best practice flaws within the Federal Government, but also a recognition that those things have to be rippled out to private corporations, the banking community. Certainly Target's been mentioned here, but it wasn't the only commercial site hacked during this period of time. So I join with the gentleman, and you can count on there being a series of briefings and possible committee hearings on them.
I thank the Chairman. Yield back.
We now go to the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Walberg.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to the witnesses for being here. Ms. Fryer, we've dealt with the memo and your ultimate decision not to send it, but I think there are still questions that are there, and it can't be just simply a out of sight, out of mind issue. So let me ask you a question. In your testimony last month before the committee, you characterized the mitigation plan identified in the risk decision memo as, quote, added protections to compensate for those unknown risks. What did you mean by this, specifically those unknown risks?
So the security testing in September was not to the level that was expected, so they weren't able to test fully for the confidentiality and integrity areas. So in order to compensate for those compensating controls, we added those were additional protections for the overall marketplace system.
Well, is a mitigation able to effectively address the vulnerabilities in the nearly half of the modules that made up the marketplace that were not fully security tested?
It was layered protection, so layered protection was put into place to at least mitigate the risk of those. You can't mitigate unknown risks. So again, we have those layered protections in place.
Well, based upon that, let me go on. Ms. Fryer and Mr. Charest, is it true that a good security control assessment makes it easier to create a good, tight mitigation plan?
I would say so, yes, sir.
Would you agree, Ms. Fryer?
Yes, I do, sir.
Is it true that the more understood the risks, the better it is to create a plan to address those risks? Mr. Charest, Ms. Fryer?
Yes, sir, it is.
Just establishing the pattern here.
Yes, sir.
Is it possible to mitigate unknown risks?
I don't know of any way to do that, sir.
No, sir.
How difficult is it to mitigate unknown risks?
There are always unknown risks. So when you say how to mitigate a specific unknown risk, obviously it's unknown. So what you do is you create an environment as we have, which is a defense in depth strategy. It's the infrastructural components. It's the methodologies that you utilize for your IT systems. It's the preponderance of all of these elements, and then those teams that are designed to watch those elements in operation that will allow you to, in essence, address unknown risk.
But clearly, with this testimony, to advance the rollout with unknown risks out there, with unclear mitigation, certainly appears, I think, to this committee to be a concern worth addressing and worth having these hearings over. But Mr. Bateman.
Would the gentleman yield just to?
Yes,
I think the gentleman makes an extremely good point, and I might note that Ms. Fryer had made it clear that there were tests that could have been done that would have caused the unknown risk to be less unknown. The gentleman.
I concur. Mr. Bateman, Teresa Fryer had a discussion with you about the security risk of HealthCare.gov. Is that correct?
There was a video conference call, I think you're probably referring to, on September 20th, in which
you had a discussion.
She participated. That's right.
What did Ms. Fryer tell you in that video conference call?
As I recall, the CIO of CMS at the time was Tony Trankel, and I believe Tony said that both he and Ms. Fryer were uncomfortable with signing the ATO.
Did you relay that discomfort with anyone about healthcare.gov who had the authority to operate within HHS?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand.
Did you relay Ms. Fryer's discomfort with the risk and signing the authority to operate with HHS?
Yes, I did.
Did you tell this information to anyone, including Ned Holland or Jim Core?
I shared it with a few people, Ned Holland and Deputy Secretary Core, yes.
What did you tell them?
I thought it was noteworthy that the Chief Information Security Officer for CMS had expressed that she was uncomfortable signing it. On the other hand, I didn't consider it a red flag, so I wanted to share it with them. But Ms. Fryer wasn't the operational security person, and CMS has an official who's responsible for that. So I thought that he was probably in a better position to know what changes had been made and what was going to launch on October 1st.
The gentleman's time has expired. We now go to the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Lynch, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank the ranking member as well. Mr. Bateman, I want to go back some previous questioning. I'm not sure if it was Mr. Cummings or Mr. Tierney. They talked about the beta approach that you referred to. And I just want to be clear on this. During your interview with the committee, you had said earlier that your suggestion about the beta approach was based on your sort of general experience in the private sector with the rollout of IT systems, again, in the private sector. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay. So you explained your suggestion had nothing to do with security concerns with regard to the website.
No, I didn't have any direct knowledge of functional or security issues. It was more of this is a big, large, complex system, and this is an approach that will minimize any challenges.
Okay. I just wanted to be clear on that. And in fact, you told us in your previous testimony on September 10th that you had no specific knowledge of any security concerns with the website. Is that still correct?
No specific concerns, no.
Okay. All right. Thank you. I do want to, I know we're talking about the technology, and I want, in a moment of complete disclosure, I voted against the Affordable Care Act for a whole slew of reasons. However, this was not one of them. This was supposed to be the easy part, this rollout, the mechanical function of getting everybody up and on the system. So it is particularly discouraging. I've had a chance to meet with, but I do want to say this is the law. I voted against it because I didn't think it was being done the right way, and people can differ on that. But I see my role going forward as one of making sure that the people that I represent have decent, affordable, high-quality health care. That's my role going forward, and I think that should be everyone's goal here. But I have had an opportunity to sit with the folks that are running the Massachusetts connector, the health connector, and some of the folks that are going out to sign everybody up. And I had one question. I read the security documents for the Massachusetts Health Connector, and of course I can't locate it right now. But anyway, what they do say in the security section regarding personally identifiable information, it talks about all the precautions they're taking. But then it says, and it's sort of an odd wrinkle, it talks about the precautions they're taking. But then it says, however, once you voluntarily submit personally identifiable information to us, the Health Connector, related to your use of the portal, its dissemination is governed by the Public Records Law, the Fair Information Practices Act, the Massachusetts General Laws, 66A, and so forth, and other applicable laws and regulations. And they have this one called out in bold. It says, for this reason, part or all of the information you send us may be provided to a member of the public in response to a public records request. Now, I don't think that's what we intended when we passed that law in Massachusetts, but I know there are a whole lot of laws all across, probably in all 50 states and the District of Columbia, that have this public records access ability. And I'm not sure if Mr. Charest or Ms. Fryer or you, Mr. Bateman, might have some comment on that. Is that something that we're going to have to go back all 50 states and say, we don't mean that your personal information should be accessible through a public records request? Have you thought about that?
I have to say I don't think I'm in a position to address that, unfortunately.
Yeah. How about you, Ms. Fryer?
Yeah, same here, sir.
Okay. Mr. Charest?
I am from Massachusetts, and unfortunately I still can't address it, sir.
Yeah. So there's 3 strikes, and I'm out, I guess. Well, I just want to say I appreciate your efforts and your good work on this, and I'll yield back the balance of my time.
Would the gentleman yield?
Sure I would. Sure I would.
Mr. Bateman, I just had one quick follow-up that I think Mr. Lynch would also want to know. You said that Ms. Fryer's concerns did not raise a red flag. Do you really mean that her being uncomfortable with the security launch didn't raise a red flag simply because, even though she was knowledgeable, she wasn't, quote, the one in charge?
That is what I mean, yes.
I wish you had said that yesterday in the testimony. Mr. Meehan is recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Charest, what is a successful attack on the system?
It can be defined, I suppose, in a number of ways, sir, but basically where the attacker actually has penetrated the system or compromised the system, or as we call it, exfiltrated, meaning taken away something from the system.
Okay, so at this point in time then, and this is the testimony, I mean, I'm kind of interested in, on the record, and the chairman or the ranking member went through this with both you and Ms. Fryer, and it is your testimony there has been no reported successful attack on the system.
That is correct, sir.
Now, I know from my work with chairing the Cyber Security Committee for Homeland, 1 million hits a day on our banking systems and things like this, Chinese hackers. Now, the record indicates that Chinese hackers came in November and tried to get into this system. Last time they've ever done it?
I just want to parse, so there's attempts all the time by would-be attackers. So we're talking.
That's what I'm trying to say. So we have maybe 30, 40, 50,000 navigators around the United States dealing with personally identifying information. We have Chinese hackers doing millions of attacks a day. Sophisticated Russians. We had sophisticated networks that broke into Target. They didn't know it with the most secure systems. They didn't know it for quite a period of time, did they? But somehow there hasn't been a successful attack since this has rolled out this system.
That is correct, sir.
All right. I'm still struggling with the idea of how this thing was approved. The ATO decision was made from my work with FSMA. Now, let me ask you specifically, was there a security assessment plan that was done prior to the ATO decision? Ms. Fryer, Mr. Charest. Ms. Fryer, was there a security assessment plan completed and done by HHS prior to the decision that was made?
So let me clarify. There was a security test plan that was created before the testing was conducted in September. And yes, there was a security controls assessment report that was completed after the testing was.
Have you turned over that plan and that assessment to this committee?
I can't answer that question.
Will you turn over that plan and that assessment to this committee?
I would have to bring that back to my agency.
Why is that a difficult question? Will you turn that plan and that assessment over to my committee on cybersecurity and homeland security?
I believe that those documents have been turned over. They're sensitive documents. Usually we don't like to, have them out there. But I believe
it's my understanding that, in fact, the testing preceded the completion of those documents, that plan and the final assessment. Is that accurate?
The testing is conducted and then a security controls assessment report is delivered by the contractor.
MITRE didn't have access to the full, doesn't it need access to the full scope of the network?
I didn't understand that question, full scope of they have a scope.
Do they have full access to the information system and the environment of the operation?
They have access, they have a
Did
scope.
they have, did MITRE, who was the contractor, is it your testimony that during the period of time when they were supposed to be preparing this report, which is required under the law, under FSMA, did MITRE have proper access to the information system and the environment of operation, specifically?
That was the system that was being tested, yes.
What's the system that was being tested, or the full system? Not the system that was being tested, because what we had was parts of the system being tested. But FSMA doesn't authorize parts of the system being tested. It requires, under the law, the entirety of the system.
They tested what was in scope of the security test plan that was provided by the
Well, that's why I want to see the security test plan, not for the parts of the security, but the entirety of the system. Was the security test plan dealing with the entirety of the system prior to the OTA being made?
Gentleman's time has expired, but you may answer, and I think include the words end-to-end, perhaps, if you think that's appropriate.
If I understand, you're requesting the security test plan.
I want the security test plan, I want the security assessment, and then I want the remediation that was by the contractor and HHS, in which they resolved all of those issues, and I want to know that they were all done prior to the approval of the OTA, which is required under the FSMA law.
Yes, sir, and I will bring that back, the request back.
Thank you. I thank both of you. I will note for the committee that we were unaware of the December 18th study. It has not been provided, even though we believe it would be appropriate pursuant to the subpoena that was already in place. And it is my intention to issue a new subpoena to make sure there is no doubt that that document that we were not aware of as of yesterday had not been provided. And for the record, no, Mr. Meehan, those documents have not been provided by HHS. Mr. Connolly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It is my understanding, however, that an unredacted copy of the test results was subpoenaed and was provided to this committee. Is that correct, Ms. Fryer?
Yes, I believe the September testing documents. If it's the December ones, like I said, I have to bring that request back.
Okay.
Mr. Connolly, if I may, if you'll stop the clock.
Thank you.
I just want to make sure your question is clear. MITRE Corporation, pursuant to a subpoena, supplied us documents. Neither Health and Human Services nor CMS have provided any such documents. Thank you.
Thank you for the clarification. And Mr. Bateman, let me express my regret that you were given so little notice before being asked to testify here today. For a committee that insists on better compliance from various Federal agencies and in a timely fashion, sometimes we seem to have a double standard, or it might be perceived that way. I want to ask about security, because I have to admit, when I heard some of the statements, especially the opening statement of the Chairman, it sounded scary to me. It sounded like only HealthCare.gov represents a potential cybersecurity threat that could compromise everybody's health care in America. And of course, as you indicated, Mr. Charest, cybersecurity attacks are going on all the time in the private sector as well as in the public sector. The game here is to stay ahead of it, to develop systems to try to prevent it, to track it down, and that's going to be an ongoing battle forever for everybody because of the nature of technology. Would you think that's a fair statement, Mr. Charest?
Yes, sir. We cybersecurity professionals believe we have excellent job security.
Okay. I want to ask about, because several of us wrote the chairman of this committee asking for clarification of protocols to safeguard sensitive documents. And Ms. Fryer and Mr. Bateman, if I am hearing you correctly, there is reason to be concerned about providing us with very sensitive documents that could somehow be compromised, obviously unwittingly. Nobody on this committee would ever leak anything to the press. But leaving it around accidentally or whatever, could in fact lead to the very result that presumably this hearing is all about trying to deter, which is the compromise of consumer information. And I quote the President and CEO of MITRE, who wrote the chairman of this committee and said, in the wrong hands, this information could cause irreparable harm to the basic security architecture of HealthCare.gov and potentially the security of other CMS data networks that share attributes of this architecture, unquote. Is that a fair concern, Mr. Bateman, Ms. Fryer?
I believe it is a fair concern. I think that those documents could, if they were made public, provide a roadmap to an attacker.
It's the very thing we're having a hearing about today. We could, again, unwittingly, actually be part of the problem if we don't establish clear guidelines, clear protocols for the securing of such information. Fair statement, Ms. Fryer?
Yes, these are sensitive documents that are tightly controlled.
So were someone to leak them, for example, someone got them through a subpoena, for example, and somebody decided to, as the ranking member, the phrase he used, cherry-pick information and leaked it to the press. Again, not that that would ever happen here on this committee, but if that were to happen, it could actually lead to the very compromise and degradation of the security systems you're trying to put in place. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
Mr. Bateman, you want to comment on that? I mean, you come from the private sector. You're looking sort of at a little different air level on these issues, looking at how CMS and your own department are handling it. Are you comfortable that we have strict protocols in place here on this committee, for example, such that your concern would be abated?
I'm not familiar with the protocols the committee has.
Ms. Fryer?
Again, I'm not familiar with the protocols.
You're not familiar with our protocols. So, Mr. Charest?
No, sir. I'm not familiar with the protocols, but I am concerned.
Allegedly, we have asked an outside security agency to look at your security measures. Are you familiar with that? Do you know who that outside, because the Democrats, as far as I know, were not informed as to who that entity was and whether they've come to some kind of conclusion. Have you been made, you were here 7 hours, Mr. Bateman. Anyone talk to you about that?
I was unaware of that, actually.
So are we. I thank you. My time is up.
Gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Lankford is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Bateman, I want to follow up real quick on a statement that you had made earlier that the Chairman had also mentioned about that Mrs. Fryer and Tony Trinkle had made statements or recommendations to say that there was they were not comfortable giving authority to operate based on security issues. You would say that's not a red flag to you because someone else has responsibility for that. Who is that other person that has responsibility?
Well, as I understand it, the HealthCare.gov project was built across various parts of CMS, some of which were not under Mr. Trinkle's leadership. They also had a CMS official who was responsible for all operational security for HealthCare.gov, and that person was on the ground and obviously more closely focused on it. Ultimately, though, I thought it was appropriate that Ms. Tavener, as the administrator for CMS, be the individual who accepted risk on behalf of CMS because the project was large and being done across various parts of CMS.
As a leader that I have staff around me as well, I gather the information from multiple staff and have to make the final decision. Do you know if Mrs. Fryer's recommendations and Tony Trinkle's statements about that the security is not ready and this is a high risk, was that given to Mrs. Tavener before she made her decision?
I actually don't know.
Would you assume that that would be given to her?
I would assume she'd be briefed, yes.
Because it would be an issue to me to make a decision and then to find out later that I have staff around me that had recommended this was a bad issue, but that information never landed on my desk because someone stopped it. So you passed on the information Ms. Fryer and Tony Trinkle had given to you to other folks, and it was their responsibility then to pass it on to Mrs. Tavener, or who was going to get that to her?
Well, as I said, the project was run within CMS, so I assume that the various parts of CMS that were running the project were actually briefing.
Right, but you were the one on the phone with them getting the information saying this security is not ready, we're at a high risk. Does that stop with you, or you say, okay, someone, so that does not have a duty to be able to report, or someone else is going to pick that up?
So they, during that conversation, they actually told me that that they were going to bring the decision for whether or not the ATO would be signed to Ms. Tavener.
Who's the they there?
Tony Trankel, who was the CIO at the time, and Teresa Fryer.
Okay. Mr. Fryer, were you part of that responsibility, reporting that to Mrs. Tavener?
No, I was not.
Do you know how that was reported to her, or if it was?
No, I don't know that.
So you don't know if Tony Trankel passed that on as well?
No, I don't.
In October of this last year, Secretary Sebelius said, in an ideal world there would have been a lot more testing, but we didn't have the luxury of that, and the law said the go time was October the 1st. Before the committee, then, CMS Chief Operating Officer Michelle Snyder was also asked why October the 1st was chosen as the launch date. She said, I'm assuming it was in the law or the regulation. Mrs. Fryer, is it your understanding that October the 1st was required by the law to be the launch date?
No, I don't know that answer.
Did anyone repeat back to you, I know we have security issues and concerns, but we have to go October the 1st, that's the law?
No, they did not.
Mr. Charest, were you aware of any provision in the Affordable Care Act that required October the 1st as the launch date?
No, sir.
And anyone say to you, we've got to keep moving because the law requires this?
No, sir. From my perspective, it was just a date in a project plan.
How about you, Mr. Bateman? Did you have any knowledge of the statute requiring October the 1st?
I don't have any knowledge. When I joined HHS, it was already sort of ordained that October 1st was the date.
Do you know of any particular reason to say we have security questions and issues, the October the 1st, if that's not in statute, if we have issues, maybe we should stall this until we deal with some of the security issues and make sure we're ready to go?
Again, we work in a federated structure, so CMS had direct knowledge of what the requirements were.
Is there any possibility that there may be a mistaken belief about the October the 1st date, that the Secretary states, obviously in October, that the law requires this? Is it possible that the Administration was working on a misbelief that the law required October the 1st?
I can't speak for why other people had their opinions of that.
Sure. Mr. Bateman, you had testified, you had suggested a phased rollout after some beta testing. Was that suggestion taken?
It was a beta launch. No, that wasn't the approach that was taken.
Did you ever ask anyone why? I mean, obviously, by mid-October, in quiet moments at your house, surely you had some thought, probably would have been better to do a phased rollout, a phased launch of this thing. Do you have any idea why that suggestion was ignored or delayed?
At the meeting that you're referring to, CMS indicated, and CMS was in the best position to know, that they were confident that the system would be ready for October 1st launch.
Confidence seems to be misplaced. I yield back.
Gentlelady from Illinois, Mrs. Duckworth, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, I strongly believe that when my constituents are dealing with the government, the last thing they should be concerned about is that their personal data is being compromised. Information security should be a top priority for any government website. So I'd like the panel to sort of bear with me as we go through exactly what is in place to make sure that I have a better understanding, because we've sort of talked about all different things. So Ms. Fryer, could you walk me through the security precautions? You'd mentioned that there were many different layers that are in place. Can you explain what those 3 layers of protection are and what procedures and processes are used?
Yes, so there's the operational security, the day-to-day activities. There's code software reviews. That's the operational marketplace security team that does those activities. And they also have continuous monitoring. They have a group that has continuous monitoring tools in place, as well as, and then there's my group that is the oversight for CMS, and we also have continuous monitoring tools in place, as well as penetration testers that try to go in and hack into systems and penetrate the systems. And HHS also has tools insight into our systems. So there's a layered protection of security for all of our CMS systems.
So basically you're saying that it's not just the team that reports to you, but there are other groups of government employees and contractors who oversee and conduct day-to-day security activities. Is that right?
Yes, yes. There's many business information system security owners that have the day-to-day security activities as well as my office.
Are there systems in place, for example, with CMS to ensure that the code is security tested on an ongoing basis, not just when it is first implemented, but on an ongoing basis with secure code reviews and software assurance?
Yes. Anytime a change is made to a system, they have to do code reviews, and there's a very strict change management process that is followed before the change is put into production.
And then I also understand that there's a weekly, as you said, on penetration detection, weekly scanning and penetration testing of perimeter devices such as firewalls. Is that correct? Is that ongoing as well?
Yes. So that's above, and that's above and beyond best practices. We do weekly scans of all the perimeter devices and all the external web-facing servers that are related to Marketplace.
So touching on what you're saying about the best practices, are you confident that the security systems that are and procedures that are in place are well within or are not superior to the best practices that are ongoing with the similar types of security that is needed for other websites?
Yes, I do.
Mr. Bateman, how does that compare to industry?
I would say the Federal Government has practices in the Federal Government generally exceed industry.
Generally exceeds industry? Okay, thank you. Have all of these layers of security, Ms. Fryer, been in place since the website was launched in October?
Yes, it has, ma'am.
And they're still in place and ongoing?
Yes.
Does CMS have a security team dedicated to ensuring that these multiple layers of protection are overlapping and continue to be effective?
Yes, that was part of the ATO memo. Myself, I'm on part of that team.
How often does that team meet, talk to one another, review the procedures?
On a weekly basis.
On a weekly basis. Thank you. Can you sort of talk about how these multiple layers help to protect confidential consumer information and how they interact? For example, I signed up for HealthCare reform and, by the way, saved $60. I went from $295 a month for my HealthCare plan to $239 a month for the exact same plan. So I'm pretty happy I got a savings. But when I put all that information, how do I, as a customer, know that I'm protected? I know this is a very broad question, but can you sort of sketch how those different layers work with each other, say with my personal information that I've entered?
Well, the different layers, again, so if there's attackers coming in from the inside, we have many protections to detect these attacks. As mentioned before, there's been no successful attacks, but attacks are being made all the time on the website. So we have these tools in place to detect anomalies, all these tools, even if, one tool doesn't pick it up, we have this layer of protection. So we have other various tools in place to detect.
So you could, for example, if there is just an unanticipated pattern that emerges or certain things that are happening, you can actually identify, wait, something is going on here that's unusual. We need to take a closer look at it.
Yes, we have tools that will pick up anomalies.
I thank the gentlelady.
Thank you.
Thank the witness. Mr. Meadows, gentleman from North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to follow up on Ms. Duckworth's questioning there, if I could, Mr. Charest, and this question is to you, because she went through a long list of all the security that has been implemented, and you were it seemed like, cautious in the way that you say that there was no malicious attacks. Has there been inadvertent personal information that has been shared with someone else in this particular website?
Yes, sir, there has.
There has. How many times has that happened? Personal information from someone else getting shared with an inappropriate person?
I don't know the exact count, but in the early stages of the launch, there were a number, I think somewhere less than 10, but there were some that were reported both in the media and to us.
All right, so somewhere less than 10. Now, it's interesting that you wouldn't know the exact number because you're very emphatic that there have been 0 malicious attacks, but inadvertent disclosure, you can't give us an exact number.
Well, I in fact have the categories in front of me here, so if you'd like me to give you the numbers that are
Just a number.
Okay, no problem.
So how many total disclosures of personal information to other people have we had?
We classify these incidents by...
I'm not here. Total numbers.
It would appear from the numbers I have in front of me, there are 13 Category 1, which is where we put potential PII.
Okay, 13 category, total numbers. Total numbers, 13.
That's what I have here, yes, sir.
And so there was no others. So it wasn't less than 10. It was more than 10.
Well, no, not necessarily, sir, because the 13 in the category don't always mean there was a disclosure. They also could be exposure but not disclosure.
Exposure but not disclosure.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Well, we'll save that for another day, because I think what the American people want is honesty and transparency. And to hear you testify less than 10 and more than 13. But more problematic for me is for you to lead this group to say that there were no malicious intent, and yet knowing full well that there's been disclosure. They just want honesty and transparency. Wouldn't you agree, Ms. Fryer, that that's important?
Yes, sir.
Okay. In that, you've testified before. So in your preparation today to come before, have you met with attorneys to prep you on your testimony?
I've been briefed on what to expect.
Okay. How long has that briefing taken place? How much time did you spend in that prep? How many days?
It was over a few days, a couple hours.
Okay. So how many hours does it take to be briefed to tell the truth?
It doesn't.
Okay, so why would that have gone on? Have you ever been told, well, we would prefer that you don't answer a question that way by an attorney?
No, sir.
All right. Have you ever had your previous testimony looked at and said, well, we wish you hadn't have said that?
No, sir.
All right. So you believe that from an honesty standpoint, that you can tell the American people that their private information will not be disclosed to a third party?
As a result of the recent security controls testing, yes.
Okay. So the recent security, you're talking about in December, that security testing.
Yes, sir.
Now, we've been led by other testimony here that the website and programming and modules continues today. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
So how do you, based on a security analysis done in December, assure that the modules that are being written as we speak are secure?
Because, again, there's the operational security that the marketplace security team has in place every time they do either, and it's done during the security development life cycle of a system, that they have, any time change is made to code, they have all types of different security testing that is done on a day-to-day basis.
All right. So, but we will have additional security risks that have to be assessed.
No, that does not mean to say there's additional security risk.
Okay. When is the next independent security assessment going to take place?
We're requiring one every quarter. Okay.
So we can expect one, and you'll submit that to this committee?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And when will the next one happen?
We're scheduling that right now for the books, which will happen.
I thank the gentleman and
I thank you.
The witness. The gentlelady from California, distinguished gentlelady, Ms. Spear.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Let me just say at the outset how delighted I am that the committee recognizes the importance of protecting the security of personally identifiable information in data systems, and as such is making it a focus, because I think that one of the next hearings we should have is one on the breach that took place at Target with 110 million Americans who were impacted, and Neiman Marcus that was impacted as well, and I understand there were a couple of other retailers. So the potential for being hacked is real. It happens in Fortune 100 companies, and we should do our due diligence by making sure that efforts in the commercial sector are being as secure as possible. Having said that, let's focus on the testing that took place, the most recent testing that took place. And Ms. Fryer, when you were here on December 17th, that testing was ongoing at the time. My understanding is that it has been completed. Is that correct?
Yes, ma'am.
And since it has been completed, can you say with certainty that it was completed in a stable environment, that all security controls were successfully tested, and that it was a full end-to-end security test?
Yes, it was a full, comprehensive, end-to-end security test, and it was completed in one stable environment.
All right. Having completed that, is it your understanding as well, Dr. Charest, that it was completed under those standards?
Yes, ma'am. Teresa related that to me.
So the purpose of this testing is to identify vulnerabilities in an IT system so they can be remediated. Is that fair?
Yes, ma'am.
Does the fact that the SCA testing identifies vulnerabilities mean the system is exceptionally risky?
No, a security controls assessment is conducted to discover vulnerabilities so they can be mitigated.
So just like Target needs to do these assessments and determine if there's vulnerabilities, it is appropriate for you to do that within the ACA.
Yes, ma'am.
Now, the December testing has been completed, and you've seen the results of that testing. I have a question for all three of you. Ms. Fryer, do you have any reason to believe that consumer information submitted in the system is not secure at this time based on the testing?
No, I do not.
Dr. Charest?
No, ma'am, I do not.
Mr. Bateman?
No, I do not.
So this is like giving the system a clean bill of health. Is that correct?
Yes, ma'am.
Knowing full well that just like Target and Neiman Marcus and any number of other companies that have been hacked into, there are persons out there around the world attempting to hack into systems. But at this point in time, having done the testing, we can say with confidence that the system is not subject to being breached. Is that right?
Well, there were always is this chance for vulnerabilities, but the testing was completed successfully. It had good results, so we are confident that the risks have been identified and they're being mitigated.
Now, CMS has been running the Medicare system for decades. And I guess my question is, has there ever been a major data breach of that system?
For the 2 years that I have been there, not that I know of.
And how about the IRS data system?
I can't answer that.
All right. I think that completes my I actually have one more question. This committee passed a bipartisan measure that is referred to as FITARA, which is the Federal Information Technology Acquisition Reform Act. It would give CIOs much more authority in terms of hiring personnel and being in control of their operation. Do you see that as appropriate and helpful in doing your job? Mr. Bateman?
I think that we would be well advised to look at some of the challenges that we have, not just with this project, but other software projects that the Federal Government has done, and identify solutions so that we do a better job of managing IT going forward.
So are you suggesting that we should amend FITARA and add to it? Are you familiar with FITARA? Maybe?
I am somewhat familiar with FITARA, but getting into specifics I'm not prepared to do right
Maybe you could do us a favor and review FITARA and make any recommendations you think would be appropriate to augment that bipartisan measure. I yield.
Would the gentlelady yield?
I certainly will.
I think the gentlelady's question is a good one, and perhaps the other witnesses could answer the question of, do they think that budget authority and a single point of accountability would enhance these kinds of projects? And Mr. Bateman commented on that yesterday, so perhaps asked that way your question could get a more illustrative answer.
I certainly think that you get greater accountability when you have one person who is clearly in charge. Ms. Fryer?
Again, I agree with Mr. Bateman that it would give greater authority if one person had budget authority, yes.
I also believe that to be true, and I believe it would increase efficiency, reduce costs, and have a number of other ancillary effects.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Bentivoglio.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Fryer, Mr. Charest, Mr. Bateman, we are not here today to examine whether the HealthCare.gov website is safe to use. We have already established that the HealthCare.gov website was certainly not safe to use on October 1st and is likely not safe to use today either. While you claim the website meets and even exceeds security industry standards and claims that no breach of the website has occurred, contradictory evidence is in abundance and is overwhelming. This evidence includes well-documented examples of security problems, some systematic of extreme carelessness. For example, an email disclosure vulnerability was identified that would allow an attacker to enumerate email accounts for individuals. In another example, a user logged into the HealthCare.gov website and saw information from a completely different person's profile. For another example, security researchers discovered an open URL redirection bug, which allows users to visit the website thinking they were going to the legitimate HealthCare.gov website, but instead be redirected to a malicious website that would completely hack their computer. This was only fixed after it was discovered when the website was online. Ms. Fryer, you recommended denying an ATO and necessary authority to launch HealthCare.gov, correct?
Yes, sir.
If officials had accepted your recommendation, would you have been prepared to suggest an alternative date, or would it have been an indefinite delay?
Again, that wasn't my responsibility.
Would you have recommended an alternative date, or would it have been an indefinite delay?
Again,
yes or no?
That's not my responsibility. I can't answer that.
Okay, would you have been, if you have done, what would you have done had your recommendation been accepted? If you had one, what would you? You're the IT person. Would you recommend a delay or an alternative date?
My responsibility is not to determine whether or not a system goes into operation. Mine is just, again, to identify the risks and make sure that they're being mitigated. So that's the.
So you identify the risks, but you don't make any recommendations?
I briefed the Chief Information Officer on the security risks, and there are many other risks that have to be taken into consideration when a system is going operational.
Would the gentleman yield for a second?
Yes.
I'm not sure you were in the room, but 77 days after the launch, the gentlelady Ms. Fryer did testify that she now has confidence that the end-to-end testing that she would have asked for and so on has been properly mitigated. So I think an answer to your question to a certain extent is 77 days would have been enough because it occurred.
Thank you. Thank you. Do you know whether Mrs. Treventer was informed of your concerns and your recommendations on the security risks?
I'm sorry, sir, I didn't hear the question.
Do you know whether Ms. Treventer, did I pronounce that correctly? Tabender, thank you, was informed of your concerns and your recommendations?
Yeah, I don't know that.
Okay. Had she been informed of your, excuse me, let me take that back. To your knowledge, what IT security expert did Ms. Treventer, thank you, rely on to override your concerns on the risk and the health?
I can't answer that question.
Do you know if she spoke with any IT security experts prior to overruling your recommendations, or you don't know?
No, I don't know.
Thank you. That's all my questions.
I thank the gentleman. We now go to the gentlelady from New Mexico, Ms. Grisham.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank the panel for being here. It's clear that we are all concerned about securing the financial and health-related private information on the website, whether it was this HealthCare website or any other application by the Federal Government. That's going to be one of our priority concerns for our constituents. So I appreciate your attention and willingness to engage directly in this hearing. And like everyone, I think, I'm happy that there haven't been any significant or malicious security breaches to date, so that we are not seeing a significant problem with the security measures taken to date to protect that information for consumers and users. But I want to make sure that that's the goal of this conversation, that we continue to do whatever oversight and enhance those security tests and measures all of the time, because every day those risks are greater because people figure out better and more enhanced ways to get access to that information. And given that I'm from a state that has a particularly high uninsured population, we're going to have a high user end result, I hope, in the marketplaces and the exchanges. So I want to go just back to a couple things. Ms. Fryer, it's my understanding that the Federal Information Security Management Act defines the security control standards for all government information technology security systems. Is the HealthCare.gov compliant with all the standards set forth in FSMA?
Yes, security testing was conducted in accordance with FSMA.
And are CMS and HHS implementing additional controls or best practices beyond what is called for in FSMA?
Yes, ma'am. We're exceeding industry best practices, as well as we have HIPAA controls in place.
And that's important to me because during our last hearing on healthcare.gov, it was clear that there are inherent security risks in any electronic system. And so getting a sense that you're going beyond that and looking at best practices is critical. Can you give me a sense about what exactly you're doing to continually monitor and mitigate security risks on the website? Some examples?
We're keeping in place those additional above and beyond the additional requirements of the weekly scanning or continuous monitoring tools, the weekly scans of the external web-facing marketplace servers.
So you're going beyond the weekly scans. That's what I'm trying to get at. Give me a concrete example of what, in addition, you're doing.
Well, we're continuing those that are in the mitigation plan. So we're continuing that, and then there's the operational day-to-day security that's in place as well by the other group.
I appreciate that, and I would also encourage you to lead in best practices and do everything in your power to go back and describe that. It's certainly my opinion, and I would guess the opinion of many more, that you would do everything and enhance your mitigation plan to the highest degree and lead that for the country, given the importance and the value of the information on the website. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. There was no question, was there? Okay. I want to inform everyone that there is a vote on the floor. We're going to stay as long as we can. Mr. Bateman will not be able to be here if and or when we reconvene. You have a hard stop at 12, and we're clearly not going to be back in time for that. So we're going to go as quickly as we can. Mr. Jordan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Fryer, the memo you wrote but didn't send, dated September 24, 2013, you testified earlier that the reason you didn't send it because there were subsequent events that happened that caused you not to think that it was necessary to send it. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Why didn't you send it, though, the day you wrote it? If things happen after the fact that tell you, oh, I don't need to send it, on September 24th when you wrote this, you believed everything you wrote, correct?
Yes, yes. That was being prepared as a memo. Usually an ATO package would go up to the Chief Information Officer, and that
all I'm asking is, on September 24th, the date on the memo, when you wrote there is no confidence that personal identifiable information will be protected, that's a pretty big statement. Why didn't you send it that day?
Because this was just trying to capture what was already briefed on September.
Something that important, again, you said it was events that happened the next week that caused me not to send it. But on that day, you believed everything you wrote here. These are big statements. Why not send it? Did someone talk to you and tell you, hey, Teresa, don't send that memo?
No, sir. A decision had been made to elevate to Marilyn Tavener.
That doesn't change the fact that you were going to send this to Mr. Trinkle directly above you in the chain of command. I just wonder why you didn't send it. If I write all this stuff down, important stuff, and also based on testimony we had at a previous hearing, you were the only one who read the MITRE report prior to this memo. I would assume that had a big impact on why you wrote the things you did. All I'm wondering is why you didn't send it. If I have this information, I know this thing's not ready. I do this memo, hard-hitting memo that says this thing isn't even close to being secure, no end-to-end testing's done, and then I don't send it.
Because it was part of the ATO package that was not going up
Okay.
to Mr.
All right. Let me change here a little bit. You were interviewed a month ago by the committee, and the young lady behind you, Ms. O'Connor, accompanied you in that interview. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And Mr. Charest, you were interviewed last week, and Ms. O'Connor also accompanied you in that interview?
Yes, sir, that's correct.
And Mr. Bateman, you were interviewed 2 days ago, and Ms. O'Connor also accompanied you to that interview. Is that correct?
That is correct.
In the interviews, we learned, in your, Mr. Charest, we learned you said that there was a meeting on September, I believe September 10th, where all the key leadership folks from Ms. Tavener, Mr. Core, CMS, and HHS were there. And after the meeting, you weren't at that meeting, Mr. Charest, but Mr. Bateman was. After that meeting, Mr. Bateman, you had a conversation, and here's the transcript. You said, after the meeting, he recommended a delayed rollout. Your answer was, that's my recollection, yes. A delayed rollout of healthcare.gov. Your answer, that's my recollection. Now, 2 days ago when we talked to Mr. Bateman, which I wasn't in your interview, but I was in Mr. Bateman's interview, Mr. Bateman said that was not accurate. Do you stand by the statements you made to the committee staff 1 week ago?
Yes, I do.
Okay, Mr. Bateman, he said that you said to him in a conversation after that meeting, you recommended not rolling it out. Is that accurate?
That is accurate. I'm sorry. Could you rephrase that? I'm sorry.
You recommended not rolling out healthcare.gov on October 1st.
No, that is not.
So which one of you told the truth to, which one's lying and which one's telling the truth? Mr. Charest said you had a conversation. Now, you've worked with Mr. Charest for a while, Mr. Bateman?
I have.
Do you have a good working relationship?
We have a great working relationship.
Mr. Charest, is that accurate? You've worked with Mr. Bateman obviously a while. Do you have a good working relationship?
Yes, I do.
You normally understand when he communicates to you what he's saying?
Yes, I do, sir. But
so you recommended, your recollection was he recommended, that Mr. Bateman recommended not rolling out healthcare.gov. He's saying that's not what happened at all in that conversation.
Well, with all due respect, sir, that's not exactly what my testimony, I was asked that question several times to sort of clarify what I meant by delayed rollout. And what I hope I made clear, and I would like to make clear here to you, sir, is that I didn't know exactly what he meant. This conversation took place. It was probably less than 2 minutes, literally, and it was 4 months ago. And I didn't ask him the details. To me, as an IT professional of over 30 years, a delayed rollout could have been a phased rollout, which is actually what I was thinking he meant, but I didn't ask, and he didn't offer. I don't know what he meant, and that is my recollection, though, that that's what was said.
But the point is there was no delayed rollout.
Not to
you
my
understood
knowledge.
that was what he wanted to do?
I understood that he made a recommendation.
You agreed with that. Ms. Fryer agreed with that, and it wasn't done.
No,
correct?
sir, it wasn't done.
Okay. Prior to coming today, did the three of you sit down with Ms. O'Connor and talk about what was going to take place at today's hearing and discuss what kind of answers you might give, what kind of questions you might receive?
Yes, sir, I did.
Ms. Fryer?
Yes.
Mr.
Yes,
Bateman?
I did.
Oh, so you worked it out after you had this disagreement. One said there was, that you said delay, and then you said there wasn't. You sat down and talked this out.
No, that isn't what happened.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, I see I'm over time. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. We now go to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Cartwright.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to start off by giving Mr. Charest and Mr. Bateman a chance to more fully respond. My colleague just basically said one of the two of you is not telling the truth, and I want to give you each a chance to fully talk about that.
So let me begin. As I said earlier, at the September 10th meeting, there was a discussion topic about a beta rollout. It was simply a discussion topic. I, after the meeting, mentioned it to Kevin Charest. That meeting was 4 months ago. I talked to Mr. Charest 10 times a day about various things in an operational capacity. This wasn't a high priority topic, and I'm sure that, the words could have changed over time.
I thank you for that, Mr. Charest.
Yes, sir. Basically, I would just, I don't believe that what I said is inconsistent with what I understand Mr. Bateman has been saying, which was an alternative rollout schedule. There are many different terms used in IT, and, I may have just processed it that way, but fundamentally we're saying the same thing.
And my understanding is, just to be clear, Mr. Bateman's recommendation had nothing to do with security. Is that correct, gentlemen?
It simply had to do with my observation from seeing how other companies have rolled out large, complex systems to the public.
All right. Now, Ms. Fryer, I didn't mean to leave you out. You are the Chief Information Security Officer at CMS. In that capacity, you raised concerns in September about the status of security testing for the website. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
And during your interview with committee staff, you explained that in your role as Chief Information Security Officer, your job is to make recommendations to your boss, the Chief Information Officer. At the time, that was Tony Trenkle, right?
Yes, sir.
You explained to the committee staff that your role was not to make the final decision on whether to go forward. Am I correct in that?
Yes, that's correct, sir.
The Chief Information Officer, Mr. Trenkle, was a career executive with decades of experience. Is that true?
Yes, sir.
Did you have respect for Mr. Trenkle? Did you value his experience and his expertise?
Yes, I did.
You told us during your interview that during the 2 years in your position, Mr. Trenkle often accepted your recommendations, but there were other instances when he did not, and those were unrelated to the HealthCare.gov website. Am I correct in that?
Yes, sir.
Now, in this case, Mr. Trenkle decided to recommend to Administrator Tavenner that she go forward with the authority to operate. But that was only after strong mitigation strategies were added to the ATO in order to mitigate against the risks you identified. Sitting here today, do you believe that you provided Mr. Trenkle with the information necessary to enable him to make an informed decision about moving forward?
Yes, I provided him the risks that were discovered during testing from a security perspective, and as the Chief Information Officer, he takes that in, and there's many other teams that provide other risks. There's business risks, mission risks, and all that is taken into consideration when a decision is made to put a system into operation.
Okay. You said during your interview that Mr. Trenkle, in his capacity as Chief Information Officer, had a broader perspective on various risks for the federally facilitated marketplace. So when he was making his evaluation, you were one of several sources from which he was receiving information. Is that true?
Yes, that's right.
Okay. Ultimately, Administrator Tavenner signed the authority to operate based on her recommendation from her Chief Information Officer, Mr. Trenkle. So in your view of the appropriate rules and authorities of various CMS officials, do you believe Mr. Trenkle's actions complied with FSMA?
Again, he was the one responsible for whether or not a system goes into operation. I can't answer, or speculate as to what path he took, but.
Well, thank you. My time is up, and I thank all of you for coming today.
Thank you. Now we go to Mr. Woodall. Mr. Woodall, we are very close on time, so be as pithy as possible.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As we enter hour 3, my questions are primarily for Ms. Fryer and Dr. Charest. I want to thank you both for your military service as well as your service here. I understand you, Dr. Charest, have spent some time in the great state of Georgia over the years. We welcome you back anytime you want to come back. Bring your big brain and your pocketbook down there to spend with us.
Thank you, sir.
I want to talk about a meeting that took place back on September 23rd. I don't believe either of you all were there. It was a meeting with Michelle Snyder and George Lenores and Tony Trenkle. You prepared a slide for that presentation identifying some of the high risks that you had found, Ms. Fryer. And I want to put a slide up on the wall. I want to ask you to help me understand this. This is about authority to connect agreements. And what I want to look at is that from my reading of this slide, I want you all to help me with it. It says 17 states did not have authority to connect agreements here on September 23rd. And the recommendation was to go ahead and
allow these states to have day one operation authority, notwithstanding the risks that are listed below. And those risks listed below include things like, in most cases, one or more reviews of security documentation have not been completed. In other words, no review of security documentation has been completed. And even more troubling, the third risk, CMS is accepting risk on behalf of its federal partners, the IRS, DHS, and SSA, which could have legal implications in the event of a data breach. Am I reading this slide correctly to say that in many cases no review of security had taken place, but it was the decision of CMS to assume the risk to allow these 17 states to connect on day one? Ms. Fryer?
I can't speak to this slide. I did not have input into this slide, but I do know that CMS did establish a baseline of security requirements that the states had to meet in order to be granted an authority to connect by the Chief Information Officer.
There was such an authority in place, but what this slide says is, in most cases, not even one review had been completed, and we're willing to waive that responsibility and assume that risk for a period of 90 days. At least that's how I'm reading this slide. But you're saying as Chief Information Security Officer, you weren't involved in that decision-making at all?
No, again, this was the marketplace security team that was involved in the state-based security requirements.
Dr. Charest, is that something that you have seen before? There is not one colleague out of 434 that has the authority to accept risk on my behalf and on behalf of my constituents. This seems incredibly unusual. CMS is accepting risk on behalf of the IRS and the Department of Homeland Security. Is this something that you have seen before? We've talked about best practices a lot while we've been here. This seems alarming to me. Am I misreading what I'm seeing on this slide?
Well, sir, what I would tell you is I've not seen this other than it was showed to me during my transcribed interview. But basically, this is a PowerPoint presentation. So when I look at that, I'm assuming, and I'd have to assume it, that some discussion between CMS and those entities that is indicating it's accepting risk for took place.
Is it, again, we've talked a lot about best practices today, is it best practices to, again, while formal testing has not been completed, while no site visits have occurred, and while in most cases not even one review of security documentation has been completed and weaknesses are not known, is it best practices to allow folks to connect to CMS, HHS, IRS, and DHS, or was this an extraordinary exception? And if we go back and review another 10 years of documentation, we're likely not to see anything else like this again. Can you all, because you're the experts.
I've not seen it before, sir.
Yeah, and again, it is best practices, and I know CMS had baseline security requirements in place for the state. Again, I can't speak to,
Now, Mr. Bateman, had you been in this meeting instead of Mr. Trinkle at the time, would this have raised red flags for you?
Yeah, I didn't have the background on this, so I wouldn't be able to answer that. I can say that all decisions involve some degree of risk, and there probably were discussions, as Mr. Charest said, that mitigated that risk.
I wish we had time to talk about whether October 1 really was a legal deadline or whether it was just a politically desirable deadline and whether we needed to assume those risks on behalf of the American people. But as you said earlier, Mr. Bateman, we're going to do more of these rollouts in the future, and whatever we can learn from this one will no doubt make us better next time around. Thank you all for being here.
I thank the gentleman. I'll now recognize myself for 5 minutes as we wrap up. Mr. Bateman, is it accurate that you didn't make a recommendation of a limited launch of HealthCare.gov until after you were aware of significant problems with the development of HealthCare.gov and after you heard of concerns with the security testing?
I made the recommendation. It wasn't a recommendation. It was a discussion topic on September 10th. And, I hadn't been directly involved. We have a federated structure, so I wasn't directly informed of any specific issues.
Let me keep going. Do you, Mr. Bateman, do you or anybody ever recall a time when an ATO was elevated to an administrator of an agency because both the Chief Information Security Officer and the Chief Information Officer refused to sign the ATO?
I'm not aware of any.
Ms. Fryer?
No, sir.
Mr. Chair?
I'm not aware either.
Do any of you ever recall reviewing an ATO that did not list a single specific security that was identified by the security control assessment? Anybody ever recall that?
I'm sorry, sir. I'm not sure I understand the question.
It's a security risk, I should say. Do any of you ever recall reviewing an ATO that listed the main risk for proceeding as a lack of complete security testing? Ms. Fryer?
We do have systems that have indicated that the security testing, there were issues raised during security testing, and it is a risk. But normally it is a high.
Any others that were launched without doing the security risk assessment?
No, sir.
Let me ask you, what when it was launched, Ms. Fryer, what percentage of the data transfer to the local servers was done over a secure socket layer?
I can't answer that question. I was not involved in the operational day-to-day security and the details of that.
You are the Chief Security Officer, aren't you not, for this? What percentage today of the data transfer is done over a secure socket layer?
Again, that's the operational. I'm not involved in the development and implementation of the.
But you are in charge of the review of it, correct?
I'm in charge of the review of the findings during the security control assessment that the independent security control assessments that are conducted. Yes.
Are any of you aware what percentage of the data, when it goes from the computer to the server, is done over a secure socket layer? None of you know the answer to that question? How much of this data as it's transferred is encrypted?
The data is encrypted. It is a requirement to
What
be encrypted.
percentage of the data is encrypted?
It is encrypted.
What percentage of it?
It would be 100% of the data.
But you just said you don't know what percentage is done over an SSL.
You're asking what percentage during testing.
No, I want to know of the actual live site when somebody in Missouri signs up and they're sending that information, is it all done over an SSL?
They don't send the information over. It depends on if it's a state-based marketplace or are they accessing.
If you're using healthcare.gov, is that information encrypted or not?
Yes.
What percentage of it?
It's encrypted. It's 100%.
Was it on day one?
Yes, that was the requirement to be in place.
But you don't know what percentage was done over a secure socket layer, which is somewhat similar to saying, is it encrypted or not? And you said you didn't know.
Again, I don't know the technology. I'm not involved in the operational day-to-day security. I have almost 200 FSMA systems in CMS. And that's why we have information.
So when I have questions about JavaScript and how you encrypt some of that, you wouldn't know the answer to that.
I know the technical. I don't know of every system in CMS. I don't know the.
We're talking about healthcare.gov. It's probably the most visible. Who does know the answer to that question?
The Information Systems Security Officer is the group for the day-to-day development and implementation of security requirements for healthcare.gov.
It scares the living daylights out of me that none of the three of you know the definitive answer about SSLs. And if anybody else cares to offer anything, we have a vote on the floor. I'm about to close this hearing. Does anybody else have something to offer regarding that point? Listen, we need this stuff to be encrypted 100% of it, 100% of the time. I thank you all for your participation today. This hearing is adjourned.